Dr. Jazz.
Oh, but it's super that we hooked up, and thanks for sending the book. I love the book, by the way. It's something I've been kind of investigating in thoughts, at least, this boundary between improvisation and composition, especially. And I think you've been doing this for such a long time, and so I really love the book. So thanks for sending it. And
yeah, well, thanks for taking an interest.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I want to start actually with this one, just for everyone out there. Like,
let's do it.
Yeah. People should check it out. Like, if you're interested in this topic of music, actually, and just like what's the story? There's like a foreword, of course, in it, which I've read, but like for the people out there, like,
sure.
How come you decided to do this one? I mean, what's the story behind there?
Well, it didn't actually start out as a book. I had a really marvelous band in the early 2000s, and when it imploded, one person who was key wanted to do something different. I was sort of left without a band, and I was reevaluating, why am I doing this? So I went through a period of time of reading just about anything I could about music, especially in terms of the engagement with it. I read a lot of musicology and so forth. And I got really frustrated with the general Eurocentricism of most of it. The sort of assumed superiority of European classical music, which I have lots of respect for. That's not the issue, right?
Sure.
And this had sort of been around, and I don't think I'm alone with this particular competition, not initiated by us. And I had to think about it, and I'd had some thoughts that went back a long time. Of course, things I picked up from fellow musicians and turning it over. And at some point, I decided I'd write some essays, basically originally to clarify my own thinking. But I ran it as a blog, so I had an audience of 20 people or something like that. But at least I knew somebody was going to read it.
Yeah.
And that kept me going. I got about 10 chapters in, and they were just essays. And then I said, why am I doing this? Stopped for a few years. And then Jason Huang asked me to write some liner notes for a record of his for his Sing House group, which I really think is.
I love it. Yeah, it's amazing.
And he said, wow, I'd like to see some of your other writing. So I dug around and said, oh, I have a book. I have an obligation to finish this. So that's the personal engagement. The thought process behind it was, we have these sort of pre-made definitions or assumptions of what music are. We have a commercial market version of what it is. We have a conservatory version of what it is. We have et cetera, et cetera. And these sort of unexamined assumptions are all around this. So I said, well, let's rethink it. And of course, I'm going from my own personal experience. I design music for groups, so I compose, but I also work as an improviser. But I'm also I was really interested in, what are the ethics involved in this? Why are we doing this besides, oh, I want to show I'm a great musician or it's fun, all of which is fine if you want to do that. But what's really happening here? Why do we make certain decisions rather than other decisions? And I found out I wasn't alone in this, but I didn't know it at the time I was exploring these ideas. The social structure of how we coordinate music is really part of the compositional structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually, if we're going to, the thinking with the music is really a process, not a made object. Of course, there is a body of sound through which all these communications travel. But principally what it is it's a human activity, whether it's listening, whether it's the generating of sound, whether it's the thinking about it. I'm trying to think of the writer. There was a New Zealand English writer who wrote a book called Musicking, and why am I forgetting his name right now? He also wrote a book called Music of the Common Tongue. I haven't mentioned it, but I can't remember his name right now. Anyway, he also pursued the same line of thought, that the way we interact is actually part of the music itself. But when I was developing the ideas, I wasn't aware of that. But I think from being with musicians, working with it, listening to people talk, that there is a sort of an assumption here that wasn't really stated, which is fine, but I wanted to go further with it. So if you look at music as an activity rather than as a made object, then it starts to become a whole level of things. For example, what goes on in one's imagination as you're imagining a sound, the actual physical sound itself, which has a mind of its own, okay? And then the social organization of how we coordinate. It's one thing if you do it all by yourself, but if you're working with people, how do you communicate an idea? How do you coordinate to make particular sounds you have in mind? And this whole social structure is actually the music itself, the sound of the music itself. I think the music is all of that, but the sound of the music of that is like the skin or the surface or the symptom of all these other things that when we listen closely, we're actually engaging with much more than just the sound, with no disrespect intended the sound in the least. So from there, it's not like what came first, what came second, but the idea that composition as an action, because it literally in its Latin root means putting things together, period. That's it. So when you put sounds together. But what really makes composition, unlike what you'll get in a composition class, which is really what I call sound design, is you make decisions. That's it. I use this sound instead of that sound. I do it in this way and that way. So composition is a process of making choices. So how it relates to the sort of dialogue between the European model of composed music and what we call improvisation is that in each case, people are making compositional decisions. I'm putting these sounds together, but they're doing it in very different environments. If you're, for example, doing it by way of a conventional notation system that you're counting on other people to read, and it's going to go through this particular process, and you make all these decisions, and then the piece is played as a fixed object, that's one thing. Likewise, if you're working in a studio, inventing the material, even if you're a DJ, and then you create this fixed object, it's a very similar relationship. But if you're in a situation where you're with other people who are making decisions all at the same time, you do not have complete control over what's happening anymore, or even the idea of complete control. So you have to have reciprocal relations. And in that sense, it becomes political and it becomes ethical. How do you want to relate with other people? How is music an acting out of how we want to interact as human beings? And there's plenty of precedent for that. And in my case, I found that's where my gravity has always been. I have some training in European compositional techniques. I did the whole kind of bass, counterpoint and, all that. I mean, I've been there. I know what that is, but it has intrigued me as interesting, but it's never been something, wow, I just can't wait to be in a box someplace writing all day by myself and taking it. I'm much more interested in people. So I'm trying to own that reaction. What does that come from? And so I created terms for this. I consider when you have one person who makes all the decisions about what sounds, I call it monological, like a monologue. It's one voice. And what we call improvisation or collective improvisation, that is to say where people are responding to each other, I call that dialogical, which makes sense, right? So as forms in terms of the sound, therefore you can't listen to them the same way. If you acknowledge that the sound is not just some object you like, oh, she loves me not, right? Oh, I like this flavor today, let me push my button. Which, okay, there's nothing wrong with any of these things. It's just a question of seeing what else is there. Then you have to listen to the actions of people. It's personified music, just like in theater. There's a person making these decisions. Even if it's computer music, even if it's somewhere, there's a human being on the other side, which of course opens the window to empathy and that particular element of imagination that many of us as listeners learn to do. So if I hear a composition by a established European master like Stravinsky, I know I'm just listening to Stravinsky, even though I can hear him listening to other people. I'm listening to his and his design, and I know there's nothing in the way. But if I'm listening to Ornette, right? Okay, now what I'm hearing is a whole bunch of people making decisions and somehow making a community of sound out of that. But also, there's the differences. It always changes. It can't be predicted simply by the nature of the landscape. But in both cases, they're just as serious composition. To work successfully as an improviser is just as challenging to do it well as it is to compose a perfect, let's call it, sound object. Right? So they're both legitimate, but they also have political implications, relations with sound, and so forth. And that, in a short nutshell, are the basic ideas of the book. Because, you know, we also have a lot of contentions that all this stuff is meaningless, right? Or it's just a matter of taste, right? And of course we have taste. What we respond to tells us something about ourselves. It tells us something about the music too, but they're not all it is, right? Because you can go further and further and further with that. And so that's the general gist of the book. I get into things in more detail, but that in a short form sort of comes in. Or I guess another idea is that if you're in collectively improvised music, you're essentially composing from the inside out, because you can't know everything. But if you're composing in a closed system, right, then, which was what we call conventional composition, you take all the elements, they're delimited, and then you work inside that space. Yeah. They both have their place, because I mean, there's some things you can only get to that way, and there's other things you can only get to the other way. So I was trying to find a way that went below any particular style or approach to music, any place in the world. You know, let's get something that doesn't have this particular set of presumptions, and then see what we can do from there. And so that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, no, it's great, because I think so many of us in improvised music who are also composers question this all the time. You know, like, what are the borders? And I'm sometimes like, you know, does it make sense to write another composition, or should we just truly improvise? And then you wonder what is truly improvised. Like, anyway. So I really like what.
Yeah, I mean that.
You know what you wrote, so that's I like that.
Yeah, I mean the free improvisation issue is an interesting challenge, because if you have another notion that I use in the book, I call meta composition, which are what are all your assumptions before you even do anything. You know, are you from a community? Are you from Carnatic music? Are you Yoruba? Are you, you know, what is the musical content? Everybody assumes this is what music is, which was what's wonderful about the example of John Cage, who basically said, it's music because I say so. Yeah. Right. So that shows, well, it shows that it's arbitrary on a level, but in any case, even that had social conventions. Without the European tradition of the concert, his silent piece wouldn't even be recognized as such. Right? Yeah. So you have those things. And if you put a group of improvisers who have their own histories and a certain thing, and they're great, you're likely to get something really good. Yeah. Okay. How many times are you likely to get something really good? Is another question. Certain things like musical textures. I'm thinking about the listener, you know, unisons, coordinated sections where the audience can say, oh, this is really deliberate, not something random. And the other thing is if you're improvising, you know, why are you choosing this sound over that sound? I mean, if it's all coming to you as revelation, and that happens to be what's hitting you at that moment, well, you go with it, of course. But for myself, I've been in a lot of free improvised situations. Well, it could be this, it could be that. But if I have to deal with an interface that is meaningful for everybody working, then I have something else to talk to that we've all decided in common. You know, and I found that the art of composing for improvisers is a hybrid of the two approaches, but the intention is different. It's to set up a situation for further composition or further improvisation. And I think that's the difference between that and because there are people who I only do free improvisation, and there are people who even take it as a political, say, quote unquote, anarchist attitude. This is all I want to do. Except that there's music, no matter what spot you take in the spectrum of possibilities, it's not comprehensive. I mean, that depends. Even that depends on people having done music of other sorts before they got to that situation, you know. So, you know, it's a really, I think it's a really important event in the history of our experience and evolution of music. But no more than anything else is it a be all end all. I'm always glad it's there. I mean, for example, I have one group that I just recorded last weekend that's a purely free improvised group. But it's that way because of the personalities involved. This is a group that's Jason Calhoun and Anka Davis and Cooper Moore. It's electronic,
beautiful.
You know, but I know these people. I know their moves. I know how they are. I know how they listen. And I knew when I put them together, I would get exactly, because I wanted something that was beyond what I would think of. And I knew I would get that. And it works. But then, you know, I have other groups. I work on very specific concepts, and we work very hard to get those concepts. And that does something else. They're all meaningful. But, you know, what I was hoping to do with the book was to sort of make the topography easier to see and not write a technical book. You know, you use the 5-chord here and all that, or, you know, it's 6/8 or whatever. You know, it wasn't about that. You know, it was about the relations and that notion of structure.
Yeah, no, it's a really nice reading because it's like, I think it, you know, it's almost, you know, you read one sentence and then you're like, you can look far ahead and think about that sentence for anyone could, you know, like, because it's like kind of general in a sense, yet also not. And I like that, you know.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And, you know, at one time I thought I was being too hard to read. So I tried to rewrite it in the plainest possible language, and I lost the poetics of it. And I realized, it just won't go like that. There is a funny thing. There was one person who reviewed the book, but then it wasn't published because it was so negative. And his evaluation was that it sounded as if I was only talking to myself. And I'm going like, okay. I mean, it's true. I created an alternative vocabulary, right? But no, I was not talking to myself. But anyway, so it still ended up being like that, where sometimes, just like when you're making music, if you're writing, there's a certain something else that happens that just emerges, and you have to respect it if that's what it needs to be, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Patrick, I wanted to ask you about, you know, your music. How do you translate to your music this? I mean, I love the record you did, that one, Tilting Curvaceous.
Yeah.
That's an amazing record, by the way. I mean, I love the compositions, and I'm a huge Henry Threadgill fan, and kind of reminded me of Henry. I don't know why, but like, how do you write for that group, or in general, the concepts for that group? How do you envision it? I mean, I've read about the liner notes about cells and two lines melodic, but like, if you can explain your story there when you compose. I mean,
I'll give some history. That group, actually, it's not the same musicians, but the notion of the group goes back to my first time in 1979 when I realized that, well, long before that, I found out that when I played free, I wasn't getting the art ensemble and I wasn't getting Ornette. And I'm going, well, there's something else going on here, so I guess I have to write. And most of the musicians I knew, this is in New York already, were what I started doing was writing it as if it were bebop, which it wasn't, right? But I found that I could, by using the vocabulary that the musicians I knew were used to, I could push the music in another direction. And that's kind of been what I've done ever since. And there were the thing about the Sonic Openings project, which goes back that far, is it's always been centered on the rhythm section. And so I've always actually really been composing for rhythm sections. And there are specific roots of that. Like, for example, in my hometown of Detroit, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a group called the Contemporary Jazz Quintet, also known as the CJQ. They did 2 records for Blue Note that they didn't really like the limitations Blue Note put on them.
Mm.
But and then they did some on their own label. But I heard them live a lot because they were the most happening avant-garde kind of group in Detroit at that time. And they were doing things with time that I experienced, and later when I developed enough skill to understand what they were doing, they were dealing with different kinds of kinesis. Are you hovering? Are you rushing ahead? Are you pulling back? And this would translate into things like, maybe something, a phrase would be in 3 and another in 4 and so forth. These kind of like blocks of sound that I call meta groove. And also, I always loved Coltrane's rhythm section with Elvin, and Ornette's rhythm section, especially because of how forward bass became.
Yeah.
And so I actually had been a bass player until about 1984.
Really? Oh, well. Okay.
While I was learning saxophone. Yeah, my father had been a bassist. He'd stopped playing for a long time, and he gave me the instrument. Say, "Oh, we need a bass player." So, but I got my passport. It never got me to Europe or anything. And well, long and short of it, it was a longer story about what happened to the bass. But so I've always had a sympathy for the rhythm section, and I did some work that was kind of based on the CJQ's work in the 80s. So it was years before I could find people able and willing to play. This has been, when you write eccentric music that's not a conventional language and maybe challenging, one of the biggest challenges is getting a group of people to stay together. And I'm not directly influenced by Henry's music, but I'm definitely influenced by his example. Certainly when I started to hear the sextet in the 80s, it said, don't be lazy. You can push these things further. And also he and Steve Lacy's sextet made me think, well, they can do groups like that. Maybe I can. Well, it's had its ups and downs. But anyway, long and short of it, so I had long periods where I really didn't have a group that could play the music. And also, if you're doing this without funding and you don't have the reputation, and if the play, I would play in a place and the band wasn't cutting the music and it would sound like a mess, so it wouldn't, it was very hard to get to that threshold where the stuff became self-funding. So it's been a long process. But anyway, I did some music. I started composing music for my second record in 83, where I started to make the rhythm section polyrhythmic. I would have the bass in one metal level, the melody in another, and then the drums could move in between those. And I was really thinking about, like, say, One Down, One Up at the live New Thing at Newport or Coltrane. If you hear things going on in that last period that Elvin was with the band, they were doing really amazing things. The CJQ were doing things that were kind of like that. On the surface, it sort of resembled Miles' rhythm section with Tony Williams, but it was actually composed as part of the music. So anyway, so these are things I heard in person quite a bit. So it was in my body. I heard Mingus's group a lot with Don Pullen and George Adams and so forth. Yeah. And they were doing things with time. So I had this sort of itch for that really stuck with me. So when I did the Mahin Kantuk record in 2006, which was the group that I lost, Hilliard Greene, who's been working with me since I got back from Europe, so it'll be since about 2000, and he's been the bass player. I mean, he has such a sound. Plus, he's a wonderful human being, amazing, great player, and a good friend. Yeah, he introduced me to David Pleasant, who's like Milford Graves, very much in that area, his own way, different roots, different path, different style of having an extraordinary facility with polyrhythms. And I took on my regular book, which usually took people 6 months, and he went through it in 45 minutes, like kind of crumbling up a piece of it. So, well, what else you got? So I said, well, for the first time in my life, I can push the threshold of my composing to things that I would never dare ask people to do, but always wondered. And so one of the compositions we developed in that time was Tilting Curvaceous. And it's just one of them, right? There's a whole bunch of them, but they really are challenging pieces. like Monk's music is challenging, because Monk is I mean, my major examples of composers are Ellington, Monk, Mingus, and Ornette. With Henry not being direct, but being like, the spirit of like, it's still there, And so what I was doing here was I had already, well, okay, here's what happened. One thing at a time. So, yeah, so it is made of about 5 or 6 phrases where I had done a piece, in the early 80s called Which Way What, which was based on a piece called Snuck In that the CJQ had recorded. But I changed a lot of stuff. I just used that kind of movement of motion that I was talking about. And that took a long time to go. So now I'm with a new group and I go, well, okay, let me see if I can push the envelope and go beyond that. So the idea of the cells is to establish for the listener a certain kind of motion code. Usually basically I would write a 2-part thing for the lead voice and the bass voice. Mm-hmm. Both of them are lines, melodies all by themselves. They don't need each other to be interesting to listen to. And each block could actually be repeated indefinitely as a piece of music all by itself. But the thing is when you go through this threshold where you go from one to the other, it creates a sensation where you could call it linear polyrhythm, maybe. But mm-hmm. When you go into a new time zone, you have this body sensation, dance sensation. Oh, the gravity's changed. And I find this really, it's part of what I'm curious about. What's it like if you do that? So in the case of Tilting Curvaceous, it's because what I was adding was, because I wasn't good at 5, I've been fascinated. Let's try something I can't do easily and something I don't hear a lot of. So what happened was the first 2 measures are a combination of a 5 in the bass with a superimposed 4. The next line moves the quarter note to 4 with with half note triplets. The third line is in 3, but it has another cross pattern. Then it returns to the first phrase with 1 more measure. Then we hit something to be like a bridge, but basically it's a line of a 3 strata, a 4 strata, and a 5 strata simultaneously. Then that resolves into a 5 and 3, and then it reprises the 4 with the 3, but the top line is now a 5. So it's all my music is experimental. I'm going, mm-hmm. Well, what happens if I do this? And then at the same time, I'm saying, can I make this that it's intelligible to a listener and not so complicated that a musician can do it? And if your melodic shapes are clear enough, they become cue systems for the players. Oh, we can go there. We can go there. Yeah. We're still not at the point, even with the band now, that happens, although the music is pretty nice. So then what happened is when that trio disbanded, I had about 10 years without a group, and I did some other projects. I started a large improvising ensemble. I had some other things. But this was off. So what I did was I tried to play that music solo on a saxophone. Totally crazy. Like, how are you going to do that, right? And that kept me sane, though, because it was a hard time for me in terms of my relationship with music. And by trying to play the 2 lines, so certain parallels would be what am I thinking about? I'm getting stuck on the name of the instrument. It's Cora. I was going to say Gimbri. I said no, wrong country. Yeah. Cora music, or say the model of Bach's solo violin pieces. This idea of how do you, on a single line voice, how do you give the impression, or Mbira music, how do you give the impression of multiple lines, but on just 1 line? So it was complicated to say, well, how do I do that on a saxophone, right? Which isn't even a percussion instrument, right? I mean, at least if it's strings, you're plucking. Here, no. And I found ways to shift the beat around and so forth, so that I could actually give the impression of the line, because I couldn't play 2 pitches at the same time. And that one, I'm still working on that. And well, I started with one piece, which was Tilting Curvaceous, and that was so hard. I never had. I said, when I could really play this, maybe I'll do one of the others. I'm still not happy. And around 2016, I had a string of local, back, you know how we are at music. We don't have a lot of venues. You play house concerts and so forth, or this or that. I had enough that I was able to do a few performances and experiment with this stuff on a group level. And eventually, Michael T.A. Thompson, whom I'd always known but had never really worked with, he had done it a few times, and he had some serious doubts. And then he said, I want to do this no matter what, whether there's a gig, whether there's money. Oh, life changes, because Hill was always there. And so we started workshopping the material, and I didn't really have anything. I just had these patterns written out, and we would work with them. And Brian Groder is a good friend of mine who I met playing in a fantastic no-net of Lyle Ellis's in the late zeros called Stomping Ground. We did 4 or 5 concerts. It was a 9-piece group, fantastic music, but we met each other there. And then we'd get together to play together. And I'd say, well, let's play some of your music. No, I want to play this thing of yours. He'd never play his music with me. He always wanted to do mine. So we had a relationship. And so the 4 of us were getting together whenever we could be every month, twice a month, over these years. And we'd get an occasional performance over time. And then I got a very, very small windfall, enough because you see, like a wonderful label like Clean Feed, they're in such dire straits that they can't afford to finance recordings.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So they rely mostly on people who get grants, from countries like Norway and stuff, or Canada or something, but we don't have that here. So but it gave me enough money to actually pay for the studio, give the musicians something, and pay for the cost. So I could actually do a record, and I hadn't done one. Well, I hadn't done with that group for like 15 years or something. Right. And so with that, we spent about 6 months, and the pandemic happened. Then we reconvened, and we developed the material that we did on the recording. So what happens is so what happened was I found that I could take certain of those cells, and from the solo work, I had learned that they developed so many other ideas. So I have a cell, but then it means this variation and that variation and that variation. And but it's still the same original, however many measures it is. It's all built off of that. So it's, in that sense, you're hearing the core melody all the time, somewhere. Okay. But it's being resituated. And I think in that particular version, I was thinking about Duke Ellington's Late Suites, where sometimes he has these little moments that are kind of inconclusive, and they suspend to the next one. And as I was putting it together, by the time we went to do the recording, because what happened was Brian's wife was moving back to Singapore, and he was going with her. So we had to get that recording before he got on the plane. So we crammed a little bit. And so my backup plan, which worked quite well, was to do everything in these little episodes, and then I'd figure out how to go together. And the image that I got was, in a sense, trying to get the image of a music or an activity that's expanding in all directions at the same time, which is not sequential, this, then that. But you can't literally do that, but you can imply the experience. So that's kind of how it all came together. I started to think orchestrally about, well, which sound I'm not interested in being the front all the time. I'm interested in other people's voices. So I wanted to make sure that each player got to be heard in their own capacity, especially the piano sections with Rod Williams. I just said, I want your interpretation of this stuff. I'm not telling you what to do. And so we got something else there and so forth. So I don't know if I told you enough, but that kind of gives you a history of how that all evolved. I'm very happy with it because it's very human. It's got flaws in it, but that's part of the humanity of the music. And I find that I think it tells the story very well.
Yeah,
That's my friend. That's my.
No, for me it was like when it came out. I mean, I'm on Clean Feet. I've done like 4 records, or so I kind of follow the artists on the label as well, right? And when this one came out, for me it was a complete revelation. I was like, who the hell is this guy? You know, because I love this sort of you know, between improvised and composed, that I'm like puzzled, and it's amazing. Yet it's still groovy also, and you know, I just hope you will record more. That, you know, we all get to hear more of your stuff. I was just ashamed I didn't know your music. You know, I was like really. And
well, I've been pretty underground to the underground. You know?
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't what I was aiming for. I can tell you that. But it's really hard. You know, what we're unfortunate now is that because the connection between the musicians is not, because I haven't been able and still can't finance it. You know, we're doing it because it's meaningful, each of us, and it's significant enough that I can develop the music to this level. Because 2016 to when we recorded it was 5 years, right? And it really took that long that the language started to make sense. And we get together whenever we can. Comes out like a couple times a month, usually at the best. Okay. And there's, of course, I come up with a new idea almost. Oh, let's try this. But you know, the music gets tighter and tighter. The current group is TA and Hill. Now Jason Huang has taken what would have been the trumpet.
Oh, wow, beautiful.
And I'd like to add another instrument, but and I have people who I've done that with, because it would be good to have. Like the piano is very effective. It would be good to have that, or a guitar. Playing yet another line, which would then free up the bass, but getting people there enough that it matures. But in the meantime, the quartet is great. So, and you know, and it's changed. You know, what I want to do is, when it's ready, is record another Tilting Curvaceous record with a different name, of course, and register how the material has morphed. Because of course, once we had that intense time with the studio, you know, we're all that last week we're rehearsing all the time. Everybody got over a certain hurdle, and everything started to be heard differently. So of course, compositionally, I started hearing new things, and that's, you know, it depends a little bit on finances, but besides that, I hope within a year to record the next version of that. And then we'll see if we need another composition or not. But it's a little funny because it keeps growing little compositions inside itself. So, you know, we see how it goes.
No, beautiful, man. Really, like, you know, beautiful stuff. I love it. It's really so underrated. I just hope, you know, people will get to check it out. Like, and
well, I would hope so too. It would be nice. It would be nice to have a little help from the rest of the world in terms of getting the music to people. I mean, because there is a community that follows this kind of music. I mean, but just to get it out, that's the hard part. I think it's nowadays. Although nowadays it's a little bit easier with the internet, but yet also hard. So it's tough territory. It's well, the thing is, if you're trying to have a normal human life, right? You know, you have a household and people in it you care about and other activities, and you got to support that financially, and then you got to do the music and support that. I know what you mean. I know you know what I mean. I'm not really I don't have the kind of ego where I think what I do is so important that everybody has to do it, so I'll knock down any door. Also being in a Black music tradition, I only want to succeed in on the basis of the music itself, not on the basis of any other kind of thing. So it's been slow in that respect. But you don't know. You put seeds out, you don't know what they become.
Definitely.
So I'm hoping for the best.
Yeah. Otherwise, you mentioned you're from Detroit. When did you move to New York, and why? How come you decided to go to New York?
Okay. Well, I moved in 1975 when I was 20 years old.
Already. Wow.
And I wasn't ready as a musician yet. I was hoping to stay around Michigan or Detroit for a few years and develop my facilities a lot more. I'd only been playing the saxophone about 3 years at that point, but my bass playing was adequate. And things didn't go well in Michigan. So I said, that's it. I'm going to New York. And, I knew a couple people. I had studied with a painter who had moved back to New York. And I had, an old girlfriend who became a continued. So it gave me enough of a niche that I could actually get started. And experientially, I'm really glad I went, because that mid-70s period in Lower Manhattan was unbelievably active. Like on one block, you had a bar called the Tin Palace, which my first job was dishwashing there, and I would bust dishes on the bass solos, to catch that. And down the street was Sam Rivers' studio.
Albee? Or how was it?
Rivby. Studio Rivby. And Monty Waters and Jolie Lewis had a place called the Ladies Sport, all on, all within a block of each other. And for those who were more enamored with CBGBs, that was just down around the corner. So that I walked into that, and the 5 spot was on St. Mark's Place. And the people who waited tables were so nice to me. They would just give me a beer or something, because it was really broke. And so I got to hear everything and everybody. I mean, you could walk, and the whole world of music was all over the place. And all this stuff, the Chicago musicians were coming through, the people from the West Coast were coming through, the people from St. Louis were coming through. And I just heard such an extraordinary amount of music, and the excitement. Of course, you don't know that these things won't last forever, especially when you're that young, right? But I at least got to witness it firsthand. And meanwhile, I just kept practicing and scuffling to get by. And I worked on minor league kind of bass playing kinds of things, because it didn't matter. I just wanted to play, And I kind of thought I might paint instead of being a musician, but after a couple of years, I realized I didn't have 36 hours in a day to do it all. So I slowly cut things from my life until it narrowed down to just music, and then eventually the bass went. I was just the saxophone and composing. But originally, I was all over the place, and so that's why I went. And it was an extremely exciting place to be. And Detroit has its moments, but no, there was nothing like New York at that time. And that turns out to have been a specific period where the cost of living was very low. Most middle-class aspiration Americans didn't want to go near New York City. They were terrified of it, which actually left it to the rest of us. And it was a really, so that got me going. That's why I went. And then I've stayed ever since, because that's where the musicians are.
Yeah.
I mean, I did live in Portugal for 7 years. That's a different story.
Okay.
Yeah, but I missed the New York players during that time. But I learned a lot from that experience too.
Yeah. Did you immediately start? Because I mean, I've listened to that the ensemble Soup, which is amazing, by the way. Those tunes, Slick, and I don't know what the rest of them. I love that.
Oh yeah, the first record.
Yeah, it's really,
so you hear the things he's doing with time.
Yeah, and it sounds so innovative, and it's like 1981 or 82, and who were the players that you started to hook up back then? And I mean, what's your story with band leading? How did that begin? Okay,
well, I started to see by about 1980, because I many of us who weren't in the center of things, back then you'd read Downbeat, you read about the music, you read biographies, you go to in Detroit, I went to the clubs that were there when people would come through, but you didn't really know how it works. You figure, well, okay, you become a good side person, you develop a reputation, because I always wanted to be a band leader and a composer. And I said, okay, let me earn my place. Let me, develop myself. And after about 5 years in New York, I realized if I don't kick it, it's not going to happen. So I decided to make a record, and I financed it by bicycle messaging. That's because my my rent was still, I had extremely low rent, and this was for a loft. So I had rehearsal space. I had jam sessions all the time. And that was so how I attracted that group of musicians was partially because, again, concurrent with the places I was talking about downtown, people were going everywhere. People were sitting in here, sitting in there, lots of people, there were jam sessions, etc. And so I'd meet people through these situations. So and so, you know, somebody brings 6 people in and they play, and because I had a set of drums, a bass, you know, and a piano, so you know, we could play 24 hours a day. So we did that as much as possible. And so I'd meet people through that. And Marvin Blackman, who's now been gone for some time now, was a tenor, alto, played flute, musician originally from Springfield, Ohio, born about 1937. And I started playing with him on the streets as his bassist, you know, and his history, he was very much into being a free spirit in a certain way, to the extent that he didn't get as much work as he could because he was too free spirited, like, oh, I won't come, or I won't, you know, and he would show up late and stuff like that. But he was a fine player. And he had been with Rashid Ali's, had a quintet that played regularly at Ali's Alley. And he was in that quintet with Charles Eubanks, the pianist, the alto player. I don't remember the bassist name, but Jimmy Vass was the alto player. And it was interesting because, you know, I listened to, I mean, I wore out some late Coltrane recordings as a teenager, and I go to hear Rashid and they're playing standards. Da, 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 da. I'm going like, of course, they're not playing it quite the way you'd expect them to play it, but you know, they were playing. So here's all these things, because I was, you know, I would go Albert Ayler, Pharrell Sanders, all the, you know, that's why I come to New York, because this is where all that is, and everybody's playing standards. I'm going like, not everybody, but you know, but that's Marvin's history, and so he and I eventually became roommates. And he shared my loft with me with his girlfriend, and we were playing all the time together. And he taught me a lot about playing. He would dictate tunes to me. You know, there were a lot of attitudinal things I learned from him, and a lot of other people. Like, don't be afraid, play. Come on, let's play. You know, don't give up. You know, these kinds of finding what are spiritual elements that, you know, get you through the difficult, especially when you're not a strong musician yet. You know, you have to work through that. But enormously generous. But generally, I've had experiences particularly with Black musicians, where that kind of generosity, you know, it's not qualified, you know, that really, I realized years later, gave me the strength to persist. You know, the kind of love that they would just, it's not always personal, but that it was there. So, you know, and he was a great player. So obviously he's a tenor player on the record. Fred Parcells is a trombonist whom I met through that cycle, and we would stay up all night practicing Monk over and over again. And I loved Roswell and Archie Shepp's sound, so I wanted to work with the trombone. I also had played a trombone as a kid for about 5 years in school, so I had a thing for it. So I was looking for a trombone player. And so these guys were good friends. James Weidman is a pianist and a fine
incredible
player. Yeah. We used to regularly play a jam session with Joe Jones Jr. down on West 3rd Street. So, you know, hey, come on up to my place and play. Likewise, John Lurkey is still an active bass player, and he was, you know, part of the circle, and these people would show up and they would play the music. So we played together. And then when I decided to do the recording, I had a reason to write the music, which I did. And I actually was able to save enough money to, it doesn't sound like a lot of money in current, I was able to pay everybody $200 for a week, and to fly Danny Spencer, who is the drummer from the CJQ from Detroit, to play on the recording, because he had lived in New York for a few years, and we hung out a lot, and, you know, and then whenever I'd go back to Detroit, I'd stay with him. So in this time, I could pay his plane fare, pay everybody. I didn't have to do anything else, right? And so we rehearsed for a week. we did 4 performances before we went into the studio, and that's basically how that came together. Then what happened was I actually had called Rudy Van Gelder because I loved all the sounds of his recordings, right? And he said, well, yeah. I said, well, I could pay for that. And then he says, but I don't do anything longer than 6 hours. And I said, oh, I don't know how I could possibly do that. Of course, when I went into the studio in a place that, the drum sound, there's some issues there and things like that. I did it in 5 hours. Almost everything was a first take.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Well, how was I to know? And then it was a really hard year making the rest of the money to pay for the vinyl, which is why I never do vinyl.
Yeah.
It's too much. But back then, nobody would take you seriously if you didn't have a recording on vinyl. You could give a cassette. It wouldn't matter how good the music is. Nobody would have wanted to know about it. So I knew that the only way to get myself into the game, so to speak, was to do that. And I pulled it off. It was hard, and I didn't want to repeat it. And but back then there was an organization that was founded by Carla Bley, and I don't know if it was Michael Mandel, called New Music Distribution Service. And they did a fantastic job of getting the music out in the world. Because you see, independent records at the time were still rare. When there was and I got reviews in major magazines like Downbeat, which has never happened since. And that gave me enough credibility that I could get work in Montreal, or, when I went to Portugal, I could say, important New York musician, blah, 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 blah. Great. Thanks. Give me the work. It worked, as far as that went. And it gives the impression that if you continue to do that, you can build what we call a career. Yes. If I could have afforded to do another record and another record, but I was always living hand to mouth. So I did a record 2 years later with most of the same people.
Really?
It's on the Bandcamp page, and it's actually off of a cassette because I could not raise the money to make the vinyl. It was too much. But it was a really interesting band because it's actually when I made the breakthroughs into my voice ever since then. That had Weidman again, that had John Lurkey, another bassist named Mark Edwards, not the drummer, with a C. So I had 2 bassists. I had a drummer named Rick Hollander, who's been in Munich for 20 or 30 years. And Fred Parcells, again, playing trombone, but also playing electric trombone with a wah-wah pedal. I mean, it was really great. And Bern Nix, who.
Oh, wow, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah,
I have to check out this record, man. Oh, I love Bern. Bern is one of the
Bern is
underrated,
fantastic.
man.
Oh, man, he was like my favorite guitarist. I had a piece that I had written for him, and I'm sorry he didn't live long enough because, again, I was going to have to raise a lot of money because the music was so rehearsal intense. It's a piece for 3 electric guitars, but arranged in a triangle where the audience is in the middle. And I composed the stuff to move around like this, right? And I tried it several times with different groups of guitar players. And I said, oh, this turns out to be a lot harder. It's quarter notes, but nobody's locking the time. So, Bern could cut it. Plus, Bern was my favorite guitarist, so that wasn't a thing. But I've tried that. I tried GoFundMe. Nothing works. I haven't been able to do it. Tried applying for grants, couldn't get it out of grants. But Bern's gone. But Bern was on that one anyway. And then, but he was having a hard time with his life with Ornette. And so he'd always ask me for money I couldn't pay, And then later on, he sort of relaxed that because times were just rough. And so I had a group with him after the version of Sonic Opening stopped in the 2006 with just him and Lyle Ellis, which was a great little band because they were such incredible melodists. So I had 3 melodics. It was a more or less free improvising group because some musicians, that's the best environment for them. You just need the right other conditions for it to work. Yeah. So I miss Bern like crazy.
Oh yeah, he was such a player, man. Really, so underrated.
Yeah. Really, yeah. And he really suffered, emotionally. He just felt neglected, and I'd call him to cheer him up, and I'd listen to 45 minutes of everything but crying. I mean, I really love the guy, and
Yeah.
it's sad what happened, because he was a true believer. He would tell jokes like, but Charlie Parker already died for jazz. He had a great sense of humor. But anyway, yeah, Bern was fine. Then I didn't do another record of my music till 1995 when I was living in Europe, because that was CDs, and that was a different history. And and again, it's because of the nature of the music. You can't just go in and do it like that. You have to have people who learn it and go through all the
But you still had groups like in between this era, like
yeah, I had some different groups after that. But I was still living pretty marginally. Let me see, after that group, I had a group with a drummer named Sadiq Abdushahid, who was earlier known as Archie Taylor Jr. from Detroit. And there's an interesting thing. When I was a teenager, I heard him and Danny Spencer with the CJQ's bass player, Ron Brooks, and Archie Shepp, two drummers. That was another thing that just killed me about rhythm section music. I said, so ironically, he's willing to play in my band. I had him, a guitarist named David Sidman. David, if you watch this interview, I'm sorry I took so long to remember your name. And Steve Swell. So we had that group. Oh
wow, man,
yeah,
beautiful.
Yeah, we had that group. This is before Steve got his own thing going, and he then took it and took off. And good for him, fantastic musician.
Oh man.
And we did some things. We had a few windows getting placed, and then I had a family crisis and kind of had to withdraw from everything except practicing for a few years. And then I went to Europe. So that's kind of what happened to the band. So we did the record in '95, the one called Which Way What. They do okay getting the music. There was a Portuguese drummer who went invisible. He just whatever. Named Acasio Salero, who was I kind of trained him in a way. He like the Portuguese music scene, and I was there from '92 to '99. And I didn't know I was going to stay in Portugal all that long. I thought I'd move to Amsterdam or something. But those are long stories. Yeah. I'd get up to those places, and then there was always some. I had a young kid. He was like a year and a half when we went over there. So, that was a good life, but it had complications. And so I got over there, and the music scene the so-called jazz scene was very conservative. But there were some people what had happened, and I wrote to everybody I knew, I want to get out of the country. And the only person who answered was a drummer, American drummer, happened to be in Lisbon at the time. So we went to Lisbon, and so I had to pick out musicians that could do it. But the nice thing is once I was there, like in other parts of Europe, the communist and the socialist municipalities would spend on culture. That doesn't happen here. I get over there and I have a $300 gig within 2 weeks. I'd only got $300 once in my life. It's like, wow. Right. So, and that was just, playing some standards with a singer or something, and so that gave me some leverage to bring some people from New York. But working with this drummer, we started working together, and then I started throwing this at him, throwing that at him, and he developed into a pretty good player with a lot of fire and enthusiasm. So I had a base that I could do there for a while, and
interesting.
That's how we managed to record the bassist on the Which Way What record, which is just a trio, although I would have preferred, say, to have Steve or somebody with me. I was able to bring Steve over to Portugal once.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, well, it was nice. They gave enough money I could pay plane fares, but still, it was slim, but it was much better than what the finances have been for me in the United States as far as that goes, with all the limits. And then a bassist named Rashid Osar Sahu was a bassist, and who again has a wonderful sound with the same kind of penetration of Johnny Diani. Really wonderful player. And so we did that one, but there it was in terms of making a profile in the, I was hoping that, I could make a living in Europe and do that. Of course, everything was in the north. Spain is a wonderful country, but not a really great place. Portugal is much better to play this kind of music. And well, you know, we made a life of it for the time he was there. It was not bad. There were a lot of really fun and interesting things happening. I guess the best storytelling was, you know, various mishaps and adventures got us going to Morocco. And first time I went to Morocco, I didn't take an instrument, anything, because I'm very suspect of cultural tourism. You know, I'm not, you know, I just wanted, you know, well, always wanted to go to Africa, and here I don't have to get any shots. I don't, you know, I could just take a train and a boat and a bus to get there.
Yeah.
So we went there, and I had known about the Gnawa. There was that recording, Night Spirit Masters, and its resemblance to Coltrane again really struck me. You know, and I didn't know that much about Sahel music, like stuff from Mali, and how close it is in many ways to the blues. I now know that.
Sure.
Then I didn't know. And then I read a tourist book about Morocco. Well, they're the Gnawa, but it's a spiritual sect and you don't see them very often. So, okay, so whatever. So go experience this country. So we travel there, and we're in Marrakesh, and there's the Ras Jamal Fanal, which is the central square. And who are there but Gnawa basically playing on the streets. And I said, oh man, I'm back in New York again, saying the same stuff. But then I talked to people with my ragged French, which I was learning on the fly. And well, they say, well, you're a musician. Well, why didn't you bring your, okay. So I came back again. So I said, then every time I met a musician, they'd say, oh, well, let's play. Because I didn't expect that attitude, right? And I made really good connections musically with people. It was like, you know, their eyes are lighting. I said, wow, I don't know what's happened, but great. One master says, well, how do you know our music so well? I'm going like, it's Coltrane. What do you mean? I mean, it's an oversimplification. But in the city of Essaouira, which is on the Atlantic coast, straight west from Marrakesh, I got introduced to a guy named Najib Soudani. And Najib comes from one of the two major Ganawan lineages in Essaouira, and one of, I think, 6 or 7 brothers at that, and they all play. But this guy was different. He was kind of like a Thelonious Monk of the Gimbri. He was like putting, you know, and doing different rhythmic things, and not everybody liked what he did, you know. But so I played with him, and so
that's how you met Date Records, right, Soudani, or to
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
So then what happened was I started to play a little more like me instead of like them. And he smiles more. I take it more out. He smiles. Wow. And so it was just before we were moving back to New York. We wanted to make one more trip down there because they became family for us. And there was a musician in Portugal, and I'm sorry I'm not remembering his name right now. He works with the guitar, and if I remember his name, I'll mention. Anyway, he sent me down there with the DAT machine and all the equipment I needed to record. He was looking for something really abstract, and it wasn't really what he wanted to release, but we got the recording anyway. And Niran Carholsa, who's an American from Chicago, was in Los Angeles and worked a lot with Tapscott's community orchestra there, and then went to Madrid about the same time that we went to Portugal. And I had heard through the grapevine from one pianist saying, this is one of the 3 best drummers with brushes I've ever heard. So I have to meet this man, especially being here, right? And sure enough, we had some of the same horror stories of being musicians in Iberia. But nevertheless, he's a wonderful, wonderful person. And so we said, well, okay, we'll buy him a plane ticket down there, tell him the story. And we threw it together and made that recording. That's how that happened. Oh, but that was an offshoot of being in Portugal. And one of the better things. And if I were better financed, I'd go back there into Portugal at least once a year. But so it's kind of hard to leave my day job to get away to travel.
Yeah.
But that's how that happened. What was interesting about that was, I didn't try to make a fusion music. I just wanted us to each play with each other in our own languages. And that's what I think, because I've heard a lot of work done with the Ganao that's kind of precious,
Yeah.
And I said, no, I was with people and it was supportive. And I'm really happy with how that worked.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, what I've heard. Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, I like that. Well, man, what a story. Cool.
Yeah.
Quite interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, Patrick, I hope you'll get some more music out in the future. I mean, it would be so great because you have such beautiful sound and concepts, and it's like.
Well, I got a couple things in the can.
Oh, well, yeah. What's happening? I mean,
So last week, I think it was just last weekend, a weekend and a half ago now. The group that I put together with Anka Davis and Jason Huang and Cooper Moore playing the diddly bow. And I wanted to do something like another recording I did was with Abdul Muammem in Lisbon, who was originally a saxophone student of mine back when I lived there. We're very close friends. And his work with prepared guitar was just so over the top. I said, we have to record, which we did. Okay. But then since then, I haven't had anything. Good, you think about it. It's not tonal. It's not tempered. What do you do with a saxophone? So I wanted that experience again. I did, I can't get back to, we want to do more work. He and I want to do more together, of course, but there's an Atlantic Ocean in between. And so I said, well, what can I do? So On has really taken his electronic alterations of the guitar sound to a really high level. I've known On for 40 years, since the early 80s. And, been always trying to find a good place to work with him. And Jason does some great stuff with electronics too. So there's the sound. And then on just the whim, I said, well, let me check out Cooper Moore, because Cooper, I mean, I love him personally and I love his piano playing, but he was actually who I had in mind for the Tilting Curvaceous record. He says, I don't want to learn music anymore. Okay. I'll call Rod. He's good too, But this was a way I could do something with him too. So he said yes, and we did it, and the chemistry was great. And then we went in the studio. We literally basically did it in like 3 hours.
Oh,
I listened to it, I said it works. And so I'll wait for a mix and hopefully I'll find a label. There's another project that I did in April. This is for me, given the sparsity of, of my public activity, despite that I would like to be very busy. I did a recording, I did a live performance that was recorded, so it needs to be mixed. This is an interesting story. There's a language school in upper Manhattan called El Taller Latino Americano. And it's about 44 years old now, founded by an Argentine songwriter and polymath in a great way named Bernardo Palombo. And they teach Spanish through conversation. But for the entire existence of the school, they have shown visual art and hosted concerts, but with no money, right? So one of my ways of recovering from the break in sonic openings was I developed this orchestra that I call Transparency Kestra. And Transparencies is a specific musical idea. I'll tell you what the idea is, because it relates to this recording. Transparencies is basically taking the idea of multiple drum voicings, but melodifying them and writing lines like, there's a game telephone, so-and-so tells somebody. So I take a line, I write another line that complements it. And then I write another line that doesn't necessarily talk to the first one, right? But I create these layers, and how they conjoin is at some point they'll hit a phrase or a pitch that's a unison. So there's a certain, it's kind of like if you were taking multiple visual transparencies and putting them over. And then the people in the ensemble can choose whatever layer they want to play in relation to other ones. So I had been playing with Carl Berger and his improvisers orchestra. And one thing I noticed was all these fantastic players and none of us are getting paid. Oh, well, maybe I invite some people to try it myself. So we did. And, we would do a live rehearsal and then present. A lot of times we'd have an audience of 2 people, right? Well, over a period of time, El Taller kind of adopted us as family. And so every month we were playing in their space. And this gave us a basis. And then, and so in a community, in a group of musicians, I just invite anybody who wanted to come, and some people would return and some people wouldn't. But part of the social structure was I wanted something that if somebody couldn't make the gig, things didn't fall apart. So it wasn't dependent on bassists or drummers or anything, just any combination of instruments would be able to work. So it was kind of like an adaptation of redundancy in ecology, that, we have 2 hands, not just one, we have 2 eyes, plants have their ways of doing it. So, I was modeling it partially on just how natural systems work. And that's been a great laboratory. So somewhere along the line, a really fine tango composer and pianist in Buenos Aires named Ariel Perotti somehow contacted Bernardo and said, I would like to do an exchange with this guy in New York, have him play some of my music, and I'll play some of his music with my big tango orchestra. And I'm going like, why would a tanguero be interested in this stuff? I don't get it, because tango is never a music that I had a heavy thing with, salsa maybe, but tango, no. And Caetano Veloso and some of the Brazilians, yes, but I since I've learned about it and I appreciate it much more than I did it because I didn't have the information. And there's a great book by Robert Ferris Thompson called Tango, The Art History of Love, where he historicizes the development and, points out how clearly African the roots of the form is. And then just, so it's another cousin to all of us in the diaspora here in the Americas, And, but anyway, certain things happened with El Taller. They gave up their space with the pandemic, and they got gifted with some funding that came out of basically nowhere, that they could permit them for a period of time to present concerts. And they, their space thing is a little tricky. But the long and short of it is, Ariel came to New York once on a tour of the States, and we played and we met, and that was very nice. And I speak enough Spanish, and so forth. He keeps it in Spanish, so I guess his English is whatever. And then I wrote a piece based on one of his compositions. And one of the nice things about tango composition is there are so many different kinds of dance moves and so many subtly different kind of rhythmic feels, and each of them gets a different melodic treatment. So he, I was talking about polyrhythm, and he said, I have a piece that's in 5. I said, cool, give me that, right? So he sent me the score, and I started looking at it, and I took like the most, it's not the best word, the most picturesque, the most stamping themselves out kind of phrases, and said, well, how can I turn these into transparencies? Because I'm doing violence to the original form, which I was actually really apprehensive about, because I have a lot of respect for what he does. And I built these transparency kind of structures, and it ended up, I call it in English, Porteño refractions. I refracted his music. It's a really interesting process compositionally. And then El Taller was able to, when he came through again, was able to give me enough money that I could pay the musicians, and enough time that I could get the people I wanted. I got almost everybody I asked for. And we had 2 days of rehearsal.
Wow.
15 minutes before the gig, And so we maybe got the material down about 80%. And, mostly I conduct with this stuff. I have a set of signals and so forth. Butch Morris was, I loved Butch, and I loved what he did. And he was an example that made think about an orchestra too. Although I found out that I didn't want to conduct the way he did with that intensity. I still wanted to play, all the things. But nevertheless, the insight, and that's why I have a chapter about Butch in the book there. So we came and we did a concert of it in the end of April, and it got a 16-track recording. And so I have 2 pretty respectable recordings in the can. They both go to my friend Abdul in Lisbon, and he's going to mix them. And I don't want to finance it again. I'm hoping that some kind of label will pick it up, that because I can't afford to do it. You know,
Sure,
so
yeah.
that's what I'm hoping. And then I do hope within a year or so to do another Sonic Openings recording.
Beautiful.
You know, but it's a day to day, month to month. You know, that you're breathing, that you have a roof over your head in the, you know, with all the terror going on in the world. You know, as long as it lasts. You know, I mean, so I'm working to last. Someday I'd like to make a solo recording of the compositions. I still don't feel ready to do it. And someday I would like to actually do that 3 guitar piece, but that's the rehearsal. I need people who are really good at their reading, and I really need to give them a week, and I need to be able to pay them. So who knows when, but you know, I'm lucky to have doing. I'm going to also start doing a downtown music gallery, which the whole world knows, the little record store in New York. You know, Bruce Lee Galanter. He you know, it's a little house party, you know, but I've invented my own residency. So I'm doing like once a month, I'm coming in with a different mix of stuff, just a sketch of an idea. I'm going to do something next week that's with contrabass clarinet, contra alto clarinet, bass clarinet, bassoon, and baritone saxophone. All having them play at the bottom of the instrument. I have a plan for it. So I'm going to run that idea, you know, rehearse it right in front of the audience. You know, I made a piece that, you know, so I'm doing, you know, because I've found for myself that the more I just play around and not get so serious, you know, of course, when I know I have a gig or a performance, then I can get serious. But in the meantime, play around, because you find new ideas all the time.
Yeah.
You know, and then you make friends. Bring in a musician you don't know, and they think it's worth seeing you again. Then you do it again. So, you know, that's how I'm swimming right now.
Beautiful, man. Wow, beautiful. Yeah, excited. Good.
Thanks for the applause. Thanks for the support.
No, but seriously, yeah, but fantastic. Yeah. Looking forward to all this new stuff. So beautiful.
Yeah. And you know, if more windows open for me, believe me, I would have I would come up with stuff. You know, it's like I don't like to write music that doesn't get played. You know, I have a whole book of Thelonious Monk where I've rewritten the music in my own way, and that never got recorded. You know, I mean, there's things, you know, but it's like stay on the ground, don't get carried away. You know, because I do get carried away. You know,
yeah, that's beautiful, man. Yeah, fantastic. Patrick, I'll leave you a nice afternoon at you guys.
Yeah, it's still afternoon here. The sun's not down yet.
Yeah, but thanks so much, man, for sharing some of these thoughts. And you know, it's so beautiful to hear you talk about all this.
No, like, I appreciate the attention, the enthusiasm. You know, I mean, you know, it's part of how we keep ourselves going.
Yeah,
you know?
and